This podcast is brought to you by the Phoenix Games Club. We are a long-standing RPG and board gaming group based in East London, operating out of Plaistow. Due to the coronavirus and our commitment to ensuring the safety of our members, as well as others, our usual venue is presently unavailable, but we do have and operate an active online presence. If you would like to get involved with games, discussions, as well as make new friends, please use the links in the show notes. We're always looking for more people, whether you're experienced in tabletop RPGs or entirely new. And now, on with the show. Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of Two Ashes You Say, the companion podcast of the Phoenix Games Club. I'm Nick, your host, and joined me this evening are Chairman Ciaran and Treasurer Andy. How are you doing, guys?
Pretty good.
All good here. Yeah.
So, tonight's episode is going to be sort of a continuation on from our discussion last week. In particular, we're going to be looking at running pre-published adventures and the different ways that they can be done, the pros and cons, as well as some relevant examples to games that we've run in the past or are currently running. But I guess the first thing we should talk about before we do that, and just as a pre-warning for everyone here, yesterday was bonfire night, which means fireworks, and they are still going on nearish to my house, so I'm going to try and edit out all those explosions as best I can, but some might get through. So
here bangs, it's fireworks, not gunfire.
Yes. But yeah, I'll try and get through that. But some of them may have to be left in if they're while someone's talking. Also, there will be some minor spoilers or discussion of adventures that we'll be talking about. In particular, those are Descent to Avernus, the Crystal Caverns, which is called Cthulhu, Blood and Dust, Apocalypse Stone, and one from Exalted. What one was it again, Andy?
Disease of an Evil Conscience. Also, Blood and Dust is from Spire.
Right. So, a pre-written adventure, as I'm sure you can gather, is an adventure that's already been written. They tend to come in three main flavours, that being campaigns, which is obviously a much longer, overarching adventure that will span many sessions, sometimes lasting months or years. And you have scenarios, which, whilst will be contained in multiple sessions, they're not as long and generally not as in-depth or as complex as a campaign. And then you have one-shots, which are the best kind of adventures for new players, GMs, new to systems, conventions, and the like. We're going to talk about a bunch of those in more detail.
And I guess sort of tips on what to do if you're running one. Especially if you haven't done this before.
Yes.
I think we'll go... there are some pros and cons to pre-published adventures, and we're going to talk about a few of them for you here. In particular, probably one of the best pros of them is that because they're already written, there's a much less workload on the part of the GM to come up with interesting stories and combats and plots.
Yeah, the main base is there, because often, if you're anyone like me, when it comes to writing an adventure entirely from scratch, it's like, well, I'm in a bright open desert of ideas of where I could go, and I have no idea where to go because I need to put the first word on the paper.
Yep. Kind of the same with me. Normally what happens is I've got loads of different ideas and sort of sparks that I could try and follow, but which do I go for? Which do I think I can work most on?
There are... one of my favourite things about running a pre-pub adventure is there are maps. Maps is one of the hardest things, in my opinion, to design well as a GM if you're not appealing to ones that already exist.
There are some good map-making softwares out there. They do take for some of the good ones, there is a cost to them, but I do think that they can help, but having an adventure which has got all of the details of all of the areas is always really helpful, because it helps you fill in the little gaps that you might miss.
Also the enemies, and it's theoretically already balanced based upon what sort of adventurers will be going into it.
Obviously you can't perfectly balance an RPG, because it's all down to player choice and how things go. But they are pre-written adventures tend to be play tested quite extensively, and for the most part they are balanced. However, there are some There are some drawbacks to running pre-written adventures. Well, at least in terms of especially in my opinion, one of the annoying ones is you do get better at this in time, but keeping the story straight, understanding what's happened, what's currently happening, and what's going to happen in conjunction with what the players are doing. You want to keep ahead of it.
So I've actually got a hilarious example of this, of where I ran afoul of this, because I was running a game and I got the great idea of, I haven't worked out what we'll do for the next arc, so I'll just throw in a pre-published adventure. Problem was I didn't read it until actually on the night, so I was reading it while they were going into it because they were going through it faster than I expected, and so I got to this point where I was like, you meet a guy who's asking you to do this, and they were like, did the guy just show up out of nowhere to ask us to save the kingdom? And I was like, I think so.
Hold on a minute, guys. Talk amongst yourself for half hour. I'm just going to read ahead. Quick, what happens?
It turns out he didn't just show up. The players were meant to, go through various things to try and find him. And,
So I have done very similar things. So in the past, I ran a 3.5e game for some of my uni friends. And they were travelling across one of the great deserts in the Anarok. And I was looking for some prepubs that I could sort of slot in a desert environment. And I found one which was from Pathfinder, which is quite sort of compatible. And it was basically this massive, huge pyramid. And the thing is, because with most pre-published adventures, they tend to be a lot harsher than I was as a GM. So my players had sort of been going along this desert, having a couple of encounters a day, none really dangerous. They get into this pyramid, it's going, everything wants to kill you. There's traps everywhere. Oh, and if you see a number of these particular sigils, you will die. It's great.
I think that segues a little onto another downside of using pre-published adventures, in that the writing quality can vary quite dramatically, as in some seem to be written with the express intent of killing your players in the most unfair manner possible.
Yeah.
And others you kind of you have the story and you're reading and you say, this makes no sense. How was the players meant to work out that person A was the evil mastermind when they hadn't shown up in the plot entirely before, and this is the first time they're meeting them, and the person's being just really nice, and the adventures just assuming the players will start stabbing them, or the opposite, will not start stabbing the guy when they first meet him and he's being shifty.
One of the other things I think is worth talking about in terms of pre-written adventures is that they are usually not very good with players going off script.
Yeah, it's sometimes when a player will come up with an idea that the writers didn't anticipate, and you're left there going, this didn't prepare for that. And in that instance, you do almost need to kind of improvise one.
Well, I guess in the terms of fairness, pre-published adventures most likely can't write down every single thing that the players might come across. They probably never expected, as part of the mission of getting into the party, for the players to create a bomb to blow open a wall to get in that way. They probably didn't really.
There's no way to go completely, to account for every possible thing a player might do.
Would that be the definition of a party crasher?
Yes, it would.
I think that's quite definitely a party. Well, yeah, that's definitely a party crasher.
Yeah.
Bring the roof down.
I'm later on in the episode, I'm going to be bringing up an example of where the players went off script and forced me to improvise a rather significant part of the game, but it worked out pretty well. That is, but that might be because of my years of GMing. I've become accustomed to improvising. It is a skill, I think, because I was very bad at improvising in RPGs at first.
Comes with time.
It's a learned skill. It's not something really you can be innately good at.
I wouldn't say you learn it. You more learn through those times where you're like, oh dear, I have no idea what I'm doing. Llamas, go.
I kind of view it like you start building kind of networks in your head of how certain situations would plan out. So you can kind of eventually you get to a point where there is very little you haven't seen a player try and do. Once you hit that point, though, you've kind of peaked. As in, if you can anticipate what players are going to try and do, it helps you a lot with your improvisation. But don't worry too much about that at the beginning.
Yeah, it comes into a discussion we'll be having later on with regards to railroading versus sandbox. How games can unfold very differently depending on how you do that, but we'll be getting into that a bit later. So, for me personally, at least, I love running prepubs, and I love playing in them. They are a very good way to tell what is usually a very good story with a very interesting plot. At least in terms of officially published adventures from people that created the game. So most of the Wizards of the Coast prepub adventures are really good. And then some people write their own and then just upload them for free for others to play, but they're generally not play tested by as many people as officially published ones, which is inevitable, obviously. So if you're going to go for prepubs, go with ones that are published by the creators first. If you want to go for something that players have made themselves, read through it very carefully just to make sure that it flows correctly and that you understand how it works.
Also, never trust the time estimates that they give. If they say it will take 4 hours, expect 6. As in,
Yes.
So 5th edition for organised play had a number of adventures like this, and it says they're going to be 4 hours. It will never be 4 hours. Unless you are effectively kicking the players onwards, they will take longer.
I mean, you say that, but I've seen other instances where it's like, oh, this will take about 4 hours, and the players just through sheer being like, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this, get through it in like 30 minutes.
That can happen too. I think at least because I've run a number of games at conventions for generally people I don't know, usually people that aren't as au fait with RPGs as I am, or some people that have played them a lot longer than I have. But I tend to want to overestimate my total playtime, and the reason I do that is because if we end up having a party where faffing around is a thing, then that can happen. In fact, it happened on Sunday for a game that me and Ciaran are in. You would be forced into a rapid finish, and that's never good. A rapid finish to a game where you just have to kind of steamroll them through before you get kicked out of the table.
I'd say also a lot of it is sometimes you do get players who are paranoid and cautious, and in some systems that will help them survive. Sometimes, though, you do need to kind of sort of cut to the chase and sort of speed things along a little. But sometimes you will just get a very cautious party that do take their time.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been in games where you've had the super worrisome thief who is track checking every square they're moving forward with, because they're convinced they're going to find one eventually, and they probably will. But I think there's a point where it becomes ponderous, but it's for the GM to be able to mediate that, I think.
Like a 10-foot pit at every corner.
Yes, like that.
Reference to my 3.5 game that Nick played in.
Yes, I still have nightmares about that day.
Good. We kept using the donkeys as trap detectors. So we're
did.
summoning these donkeys, sending them round the corridor, and if they came back, you knew it was safe. The donkeys did not come back.
They died with purpose, so it's good.
Harsh.
I feel like I've we talked about this last episode, but the RSPCA probably weren't too happy about this.
No, it's a good job they don't exist in Forgotten Realms.
That's true. Followers of Sylvanas going, what have you done to them? So I think it might be an idea maybe if we each talk about some of the different pre-written adventures that we've gone through, just to give people an idea of some of the different systems and maybe some of the ways that we prepared and the way that we ran them.
Obviously, depending on the game, it's going to be different. Some games are going to be more akin to mystery investigation. Others will be more politically leaning or cultural. Others will be straight dungeon crawls or heavy combats. For me, at least, I tend to prefer a mix of them all. I would like to have a game that kind of delves into most aspects, rather than just a straight like if I wanted to play like a straight cultural simulator, I'd play Legend of the Five Rings or something. where you are essentially playing samurai. However,
Now, seeing as you mentioned Legend of the Five Rings, I wish to point out that there are rules in that for arranging marriages and having political duels.
there's arranged marriage rules, and I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
It's essentially samurai Game of Thrones.
I know. There's So I've only played it a few times, but I do know there's like these random cultural things you have to observe. Like if you're offered tea, you need to refuse it 3 times, and then you accept the tea.
I have a feeling that's probably based upon the various clans, because the various clans are almost like their own like culture unto themselves.
Yeah, I mean it's one of those games that I think you need to have an understanding of the actual culture, the Japanese culture in like feudal Japan. So it's one of those games that is going to be a very specific niche. But
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I'd say you need to like just have an understand of what stereotype is this clan following to, and most of the customs sort of just revolve around what that stereotype is. So, the sneaky clan is going to be doing sneaky things as part of their culture.
so Ciaran has got wants to talk about a Call of Cthulhu adventure.
Yes. So the description I'm about to give has sort of minor spoilers for the Crystal Cavern, which is a Call of Cthulhu adventure by Brian Quartermanch. So this adventure is set in 1920s Call of Cthulhu, and is based in and around the famous, in Lovecraft's literature, the city of Arkham in Massachusetts. So in this particular adventure, the investigators, as they're known in Call of Cthulhu, encounter a mystery as old as the rolling hills in the forested valleys of Lovecraft country. So the general background of this is that the party are hired by a businessman from Boston to go and investigate why one of his dig sites isn't being completed. The general background the party are given is that he purchased a plot of land in a small village of Foxfield, which is located about 20 miles outside of Arkham. Essentially the party need to go there and find out why are all of his mining operations not going so well. He'd heard there was a massive cavern of quartz, which he was hoping to mine, then landfill everything and build a block of flats, as they normally do. And as with everything in Lovecraft, it's never going to be that simple.
Just out of interest, because how did this, because it's a Call of Cthulhu adventure, how would it differ to, say, a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, at least in how the pre-written spiel is?
So I find that with a lot of Call of Cthulhu pre-written adventures, there are a lot less combats, because 5th edition, you're playing as the heroes, you're the mighty adventurer that goes out and slays the dragons. In Call of Cthulhu, you're the little villager, and you're expected to go and kill a dragon. So with Call of Cthulhu, there's a lot more background information, there's a lot more text and things for the players to go and investigate and find. It's very much a sort of a mystery investigation game, kind of like Scooby-Doo. And effectively, the party are going into all of these weird and wonderful situations, and their key weapon is information, research, and knowledge. So there's a lot more sort of historical evidence the players would be looking for, so things like birth records, newspaper clippings, and old stories, that sort of thing. So it's all designed as sort of a breadcrumb trail for the players, and the pre-written adventure it gives you lots of different paths the players can sort of go and investigate, and different clues, which they don't have to go after, but each of them would give them more information and help them learn more. So I find that with Call of Cthulhu adventures, as I said, a lot less combat, so you need to sort of go at it from, I'm just a normal person, how would a person react to this? But I think that's more of a system difference. But no, I found that it was the first adventure that I'd ever run for Call of Cthulhu, and I think it went very well. A lot of it with it is the atmosphere, because the pre-written adventure can only give you so much. You need to be able to give it life rather than just reciting words as they're found on a page. So you can twist and shift things, but I find that keeping to the general storyline for this was very enjoyable, because it had a lot of mystery. There were a couple of combats, but with most Call of Cthulhu adventures, it's normally going to be a couple of little combats, maybe someone dies along the way, and then you've got the big bad at the end, which may or may not be a big, huge Cthulhu entity which is bent on destroying the entire countryside and eventually the world.
One thing you said yesterday was that when it comes to running Cthulhu adventures, whether they're pre-written or if they're just regular ones, is the dissemination of information, and does it make sense to the players?
Yeah, I think that's really important, because if you're trying to write sort of an investigative story on your own, it makes sense to you. Because you're the one that's written it, you've designed it, it means that in your head, of course it makes sense. The problem is you need to sort of litter more clues than is necessary to find the information, because it may be the players don't follow that path. It may be the players don't get that one piece of information, so you need to make sure that there's a lot more information available to the players which will lead them to the same conclusion. And in the pre-written adventure, I won't sort of spoil the ending, but there are a number of ways the players can try and deal with the situation. They can go in all guns blazing and try and just blow everything up, or they can go in a more subtle route and try and deal with things more sort of in a highly focused way. And both of them can be done in this adventure. So I think that it had enough sort of breadth to allow for you to explore different options and avenues with the player and different play styles. But I think the overall theme had to be that of caution. As I said, you're the lowly villager trying to slay the dragon.
Also a little interested, what was the biggest challenge you found with it?
I think it was the fact it was a new system to me. I'd run a lot of D&D in the years prior, and this was the first time I'd run Call of Cthulhu. So I think the biggest challenge with Call of Cthulhu is that you really need to have done your background research. You really need to know what's going on and have preparation. So I found that a pre-written adventure for this saved a lot of that work. So you had the story sort of laid out in front of you with clear investigative paths. So I think that understanding the story myself was the biggest challenge there, making sure that it made sense to me and that I knew where the story was going.
So, when it comes to at least D&D, there tend to be two main prepub types, which are dungeon crawls that are heavily localized to a specific area where you just have the one goal and you have to accomplish it. Tomb of Horrors is a good example of that. I've never played the 5e version of Tomb of Horrors, but I have played the original. And,
I'm sorry, are you referring to Kill Your Character Simulator?
Yes.
The meat grinder.
It's it's all set, spoiler alert, in the Tomb of Horrors. It's one of the most famous adventures ever written. I'm not going to get into any of the particulars on it because it is worth reading if you're interested.
It's also the most unforgiving module I know.
Yeah. If you're a 5th edition... So I've run the 5th edition version. So if you're going into it as a 5th edition GM, it seems extremely harsh, as in the players are encountering so many traps, and they will just die.
There is actually, I think, an adventure that's actually harder than Tomb of Horrors. I can't remember off the top of my head what the name was. I will add it into the show notes once I've double-checked it. But I do remember part of it involves going to a city with like 20,000 liches in it.
Chult? Is it Tomb of Annihilation?
No, it's not Tomb of Annihilation. I will double-check on this though. But suffice it to say, the Tomb of Horrors is a relatively short scenario type adventure. There's little to no intrigue or or political or cultural stuff. It is about going to the Tomb of Horrors and dealing with the wizard.
I mean, the adventure is the dungeon.
Yes.
Just going through, exploring the dungeon, getting past traps, killing things. That's pretty much the entire adventure.
It is. I mean, there are other examples of this as well, like Dungeonland, which is effectively a D&D scenario set in Alice in Wonderland. Which is a very high-level campaign where you can romp through the Mad Hatter and beat up the the Mad Hatter and the rat, who I think is a like a 19th level monk or something. It's quite funny.
Yeah, I actually have got this module. It's really fun.
I mean, imagine, like, you're going along and you just get beaten up by this rat doing kung fu moves on you. Just, like, roundhouse kicked out.
Yeah, and he's at that level where you would have diamond skin, like Finger of Death and stuff, which is quite good. Actually, on a related point to that adventure, there's actually a combat in there. I think it's the caterpillar that will, if I remember correctly, he can do a thing that forcibly changes your alignment to true neutral, which is just character ending. I think if you're he's a stoner, isn't he? So it's quite an interesting little thing. But the game is worth playing, I think, or adapting it. It might be worth adapting to a 5e game. But primarily, I wanted to talk about Descent to Avernus, which has a little bit of everything. Spoiler alert: Avernus is involved. It's in the name. The game does begin in Baldur's Gate, and it is actually it was written to set up Baldur's Gate 3, which released in early access about a month ago. It's set about 200 years after the conclusion of Baldur's Gate 2, the video game from 20 odd years ago. I finished the first chapter. I have Ciaran playing in my game, and I think it went very well. Essentially, I won't get too much into the story for spoilery reasons, but the game is set up beginning with the city of Elturel, which is close by to Baldur's Gate, just disappeared, and there is a massive hole in the ground where it used to be, and nobody knew what happened. Refugees from that were around Elturel has started flooding out and flooding to Baldur's Gate, at which point the Flaming Fist, who are kind of the police of Baldur's Gate, sealed the city, so they're under lockdown too. Nobody knows what's going on inside. They all think...
Fist, so to speak?
Pardon?
Rules with a flaming fist, so to speak?
Yes. Yeah, the Flaming Fist are not nice dudes. But everybody in the city that is locked in don't really know what has happened on the outside, other than there are loads of refugees and loads of elves that are just showing up out of nowhere. Now, the Flaming Fist are they are allowed to conscript adventurers into doing work for them if Baldur's Gate is deemed to be in trouble, and it was. That's how the game is set up. I won't go too far into the game, but obviously at some point you go to Avernus, and at some point, and this is an interesting little thing in the game, you can do a proper going off the rails in this game and just go and enjoy the Blood War, which is quite cool. And they make no qualms about that. They don't give you anything in terms of what to do there. They're just like, oh, by the way, the Blood War's going on. You're going there. Do you want to have some fun and kill demons, or do you just want to get on with the adventure? It's a very cool little thing they added into it, I think.
Just for people who don't really know, what is the Blood War?
Oh, that's an episode topic in itself, I think.
Give us the footnotes then.
So the Blood War is an eternal conflict with the lower planes denizens, demons and devils and so on. The generally evil things in the D&D centered universes. It is essentially that. It's just a long-standing war that is never going to end. Because if it did end, it would be bad for everything else. Because once one of those, it's the eternal battle with lawful evil and chaotic evil. I mean, it promotes the balance of things in general, where if one of those two won, they're going to go after everything else. So they had to establish a way that will stop them from doing that, and the way they do that is to basically fight forever. And it's good. It's very interesting. There are entire campaigns set specifically in the Blood War, which obviously are going to be heavy combat, very little intrigue. Actually, there might be a bit of intrigue, but I mean, especially in Planescape, there's an entire setting based on it. Very expensive, by the way, very rare. It's hard to get now. So Andy has wanted to talk about Spire, I believe. Spire?
Yep. So it's a module for Spire, which was created by Grant Howitt and Christopher Taylor. This is one I've actually ran. It's a small campaign called Blood and Dust. The kind of general premise is so there's this place in the Spire, which is this large city, which is just cramped. It's almost like a cooking pot of lots of different cultures, and it's ruled over by like the high elves and dark elves, or the undertrodden masses, and you're kind of playing essentially freedom fighters. And the adventure is set in this place called Red Row, which is near the bottom, so it's kind of like slums. Like, a lot of the authority don't go there. A lot of the kind of like classes which are less desirable in the city also reside there. So it's that sort of like low income area. And what the adventure is about is tension within that area seems to be spiking. Like, it's almost like the kind of riots are happening more often. People are more angry, and the players sort of start to realize, hang on, something's going on. It's not normally quite this volatile. What's going on? And one thing I quite like about a lot of the pre-written Spire adventures, because they have about, I want to say, like 4 or 5 of them, is they're actually relatively quite light. So this campaign is like 18 pages long, and half of that is pre-generated characters for you.
Wow.
So it has like 8 pages literally just kind of summarizing what's going on, but it then also kind of gives you the freedom to kind of play with how... It doesn't say like, okay, the players go here and they are going to do this, and this person will come out and talk to them. It just says, this is what's going on. These are like various NPCs that are of importance, and what they're up to kind of like weaves the sort of like structure of what's going on, and leaves a lot of the how to get the players from A to B to C to D kind of to much more organically, as it ties a lot of these events. It provides ways for you to tie these events in with the players and what sort of characters they're playing.
So what would you say was your biggest difficulty in running sort of that Spire adventure?
Well, I'd actually say that, well, one of the biggest strengths was the biggest weakness, in that it doesn't handhold you in how things are going to go down. It gives you a lot of plot hooks, and it gives you kind of like... So, minor spoiler warning, for example, there's a bit where there's a theatre, and the theatre group are performing a play, which is enriling a lot of everyone that sees it, because it's like a ritual. And the book will explain, this is a ritual, it's being run by these people, this is what it's doing, this is what it's about. It doesn't for example, give any layout of the theatre. It doesn't explain what the guard patrols are, like what the layout, different ways into the theatre. You kind of have to just sort of make that up. And while it kind of allows a lot of like improvisation and working with what the players are wanting to do. Like, when I ran this, what the players got up to more, like doing things that weren't really covered in the plot than what the actual plot was. So one player managed to inadvertently make themselves into a sort of Jack the Ripper legend.
So is Spire, is it a fairly free-form game then? I like other adventures in Spire like that, where it's just a loose collection of things to do, but no real direction in how you go about them.
I mean, it is a fairly free-form game. I wouldn't say there's like no direction, because that's I guess more of the emphasis is put on the person running it, on kind of giving you kind of directing people to the clues. it sort of just leaves it open and free to kind of create the exact details about the scenario, rather than saying these are what the building looks like. There are 3 entrances into the building. It's quite free and flexible in that regard. And there's also, as part of it, like each of the kind of classes you can play have a lot of very freeform powers, which wouldn't really work with a kind of set module. So if I give an example, in the last time I ran this system, we had a player whose character had an ability to say, "Oh, I have a friend in this organization because I sacrificed money to the god of money."
Sacrifice money to the god of money. I like it.
Well, it's what they'll like.
So now we're going to go on to talking about how to, the different ways of running a pre-written adventure and generally good guidelines to follow. In particular, the one I want to talk about is reading ahead. I don't think you necessarily need to read the entirety of the adventure to run it, and have a cover-to-cover understanding of every little detail. When it comes to, at least when I'm running games, I will keep myself ahead. I will usually read 2 or 3 chapters ahead of where the party is, just so I can ensure that there's no issue of me getting to a point where I might have to start improvising parts of the story and then finding out, as we discussed earlier, that you may have, as Andy mentioned at least, where you have changed a very important part of the story by accident, because you didn't read far ahead enough to know what was going to happen. In my case, I had an issue of a game I was running a long time ago called Dead Gods, which is a Planescape adventure. One of the better ones, actually. Planescape did a lot of adventures, and that's one of the best ones. But I was convinced that the party was going to spend the session they were at dealing with this big boss combat. So I didn't bother reading the following chapter, because that was the end of one of the chapters, and the following chapters I was just going to read them over the next week or so and sort all that out. But they dealt with the boss very quickly, and I didn't know what happened next. So what ended up happening, and it was very embarrassing for me at least, is one of my players that had actually played the adventure and was very good about not metagaming it or just like nudging people, say, "Oh, by the way, this happens in a minute, make sure you get this, make things easier." He didn't do that, which was great, but he ended up running like the last 2 hours of that session because I didn't know what was going on beyond that point.
Yeah, I think that is very good advice.
So how did that work? Like, did you play his character while he ran things, or did he just kind of stand to one side saying, "By the way, this is what happens next"?
Yeah, I mean, he had a very good. He didn't have the the full text boxes like when you're like describing an NPC and having a conversation with them, but he was able to quite easily get everybody understanding what they're doing, what is next, and how to go about it, and it was very helpful. Although it was very embarrassing as well. It's probably one of the black marks of my career as a GM.
If that's the word, like your worst black mark, that's a pretty light black mark. Like.
Yeah, I think everybody makes mistakes as a GM, and I think pre-published adventures do help to minimise some of the more common mistakes that you can make, especially as sort of a newish GM. But even so, I mean, I regularly make mistakes, and the only thing that you can hope to do is just learn from them.
Yeah, and we talked about this last week. Don't just, if you make a mistake, just accept it and move on. And your players aren't going to. I mean, they might make some fun. In fact, I have a good story to talk about this with because it happened yesterday. We have a I won't say who, but we have a GM who was constantly getting the name of characters wrong, and we all started it was very funny. We're having some fun, but we're having laughs. He was enjoying it, I think. Well, he pretended to maybe, but we were having some laughs with it. It was quite good. But it was just, it was a mistake, and we moved on from it. It was good. Do you have anything to add to that, Ciaran?
Certain person
No.
Name is glaring at us.
I'm not going to comment. a mistake, you build on it, you move on.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, Richard, I mean Andy. Sorry, I had to do it. No. Andy, do you want to take the next point?
Yeah, so as we've kind of mentioned with these pre-published adventures, they don't really handle well with anticipating the myriad of things that players will do. So one thing to bear in mind when running these is treat the plot and what's going on and the sort of choices it gives you as a guideline, but not as gospel. So, for example, players need to sneak into a party, and the published book says, okay, you can bribe the guard, you can go in normally, you can talk to a guest to get them to get you in, and then you get to the players and they're like, okay, we're going to beat up a guard, take his uniform, we're going to then replace the guard at the entrance and then let the party in, and then when at a suitable time during the party they will sneak their way in pretending to be a guard. The plot has no way to deal with this, so this kind of like then relies on you to kind of improvise a thing, and sometimes like the worst thing you can do in those sort of situations is just say you can't do that, it's not in the adventure, because it's, for myself, it's very annoying. What's often better is to say, okay, so this is a party that's going on, I've read what's happening, I've read who's there, what sort of security would they be, and just sort of kind of allow them to do something and just make stuff up to get them back into the main kind of meat of the plot.
Yeah, no, I get you. Actually, there was a it sort of related to that, I think. It was a minor complication of the party composition in my Descent to Avernus game, in that the party does not have a dedicated wizard, which is a bit annoying. However, we do have a sorcerer. Obviously the issue here is we don't really have a wizard that can learn, that can take scrolls and learn new spells in the same way that a sorcerer does, where they get them as they level, and then they just get a number of those spells that they can use per day, but they can't learn new ones really, apart from when they level. During the game, we ended up finding a load of spell books. I think there's about 5 or 6 we've had in the first chapter alone, and they've had a bunch of spells in there that were essentially useless to the party because they don't have a wizard. So I deviated from the rule set of the game, and I allowed the sorcerer to basically cut up the spell books they find and then just have the scrolls, or have the pages, and we'll treat them as scrolls so that they can actually use these things. Which is a massive deviation, I think, but because we don't have a wizard, I think it is appropriate. Otherwise, they're just going to be there because you can't really, unless you're going to donate them to a library or something, and you're not going to get much use out of them. And plus, it helps them, because they got some cool things in there, like some of the better spells, like fireball, like disguise self, all that good stuff.
I mean, worst case, they could also use the books as a bludgeoning weapon.
Yeah, hit them with the spine. I mean, the spell books, they're thick.
Or as toilet paper.
Rip
a page out, yeah. As long as it's not explosive runes that you use, you should be fine.
Oh my god, no. Wow.
I feel the Godslayer should be mentioned here.
Go on.
So, the Godslayer... So, one thing about Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 is that the way the system is built, you can kind of create these hilarious combinations which were in no way considered when they were written. So what the Godslayer is it's kind of this combination where you get enough damage that you could theoretically kill anything. So you have a wizard who can cast explosive runes. You have a lot of pages. You cast explosive runes and put it on a page. You crumple up the page, you put it in a bottle. You then keep doing this until the bottle is full. You then use a different spell, which is called Shrink Object, to make it down really small. And you put this in another bottle. You repeat this process to fill this other bottle with these smaller bottles full of lots and lots of explosive runes. You keep doing this and shrink that bottle down, and then do it again into another bottle, and you keep on going until either the GM calls an end to your shenanigans, or you're at a satisfying amount. At which point you then find something you want to definitely die. You pick up the bottle and chuck it at them. The bottle hits the thing, the explosive runes go off, all like 5 million of them. Like, even if each of them are doing 1d6 damage, which they're doing more than that of, that's 5 million d6 points of damage the thing is taking. And even if it rolls a 1 on every dice, it's taking 5 million damage.
We have said 3.5e was notoriously badly written. In some parts, they were very generic with their wording.
I believe you actually mean gloriously badly written.
If you say so.
So, next up, we want to talk about party balance. Ciaran?
Yes. So, one of the important things that I would say as well is when you read through your adventure is going to be to also bear that in mind when you're talking to your players about the characters that they're going to play. So, if, for example, let's say, for example, you're going into a warren filled with undead and you don't have a cleric, it might be a good idea for you to let the players know a little bit about what may be coming up, just so they're much less likely to die. So one example that I had of this was in my Call of Cthulhu game, The Crystal Cavern, which I ran. And it has a very sort of Viking Nordic element to it. There was one particular player, a guy called John, really fun guy, and he was sort of mulling around sort of what he wanted to do with his character. So this was set in 1920s Arkham, which is still in the Prohibition. And he said, I think I'm going to be a bootlegger. I'm just going to smuggle alcohol into the United States, which was quite common at the time. And he said, is there anything that you think is going to be useful here? And I said, someone that can speak Norwegian. That would be useful. The most random thing. And then he ended up creating this Norwegian tugboat captain who cracks me up every time he does the accent. And he fills the role of, if it moves, I shoot it. And he has got a legitimate weapon from the 1920s, which is a rocket-propelled harpoon gun, as you do, which he uses to hunt whales, as he calls all the creatures of the mythos. But he managed to fill a gap in the party and add to that party balance, and especially in Call of Cthulhu, if you've got all of your players who are book smart and none of them are physical, when they've done all their research on the mythos and then confront it, they're going to go, well, what do we do now? We shoot it, and they've got 30% in the skill, which in Call of Cthulhu you roll a D100 and you're trying to get below that value. So it's important to have a good party balance and to coordinate with all of the other players and sort of steer them away from certain roles or towards certain roles.
Especially as the adventures are often going into it under the assumption that you have a balanced party filling all the roles.
Yes. So if you've got 6 healers going in, but no real damage dealers, that's going to be problematic. So it can be a good idea to make sure that there is as little overlap between people's roles within the party as possible, because then that means that each player also has their moment to shine. They've got the thing that they're good at and they are able to contribute. So one of the worst things is if there are 2 players with sort of similar skill sets and one of them is just better at those things than one player, meaning that the other player just sort of goes, well, what's the point of me doing it? They're better. So I think it is important to have a good idea of the party balance going in.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to the game describing, at least, the Call of Cthulhu campaign we're currently doing, the party is remarkably well balanced. We have basically a person for everything, which is not always usual, but in this case, it has worked out quite well.
Except for talking to people, in which case there's one person that's
none of us are charming.
okay One person that's okay at trying to baffle them using fast talk, but there's no one that's intimidating. There's no one that's persuasive. So that's where you struggle a little bit. But aside from that, no, you've got people that are good at first aid, people who are good at shooting shotguns, people who are good at library use. Your character, who's basically the occult boffin of the party, who surprisingly isn't mad yet. Not completely.
Oh no, well, define
He'll
mad,
get there.
but yeah.
He'll get there.
But yeah, no, it's just as a point leading on, the character you're describing is played by one of our good friends, Spawn, who distinguished himself in the last session by fainting.
Yes, meaning he didn't die.
Oh,
We had a very close player death in the last session, but the dice knew what the dice knew.
And in the session before that, we had a similar thing nearly happen.
Well, that was less so you're on the brink of death. In this instance, the player has gone to their backup character, because this one is effectively in a coma. But no, I think party balance, as I said, is sort of going to be a very important thing to keep in mind with pre-published adventures. So if you are giving your players pre-generated characters, it would be a good idea to make sure that they are quite distinct from one another, that they have a variety of skills that they will need to succeed, but each character has their thing, one thing that they are good at that they can contribute to the party, as it makes everybody feel good. If your character is able to go, oh, I can do that, I'm good with this, and it sort of gives that player a good feeling that they're contributing to the group.
Yeah, one thing that's worth about if you're doing pre-gens at least, there are some ways to go about that, I think. But one thing I think is the one way to avoid that for people that do like using pre-gens and want to bring them into a game is if you're going to create pre-gens, don't create, like, for instance, don't say I want 6 players, so I'm going to create 6 pre-gens, because chances are you're going to balance them to where one is good at, they're all going to have their special niches, but if you end up with 4 players, for instance, you're going to have a problem, because you may have balanced those 6 around them all being in the game, and you may end up lacking something. So I think if you're going to go for pre-gens, I think it's best to nail down exactly how many players you're going to have, and then build them around that.
Well, one thing you can also do is give them a primary, this is what they're good at, but then give them a secondary, this is also what they can do.
That also works, yeah, that's a good way of doing it as well. So I'm going to move the next point on to an open discussion with you two about dealing with players that go off script, and in particular, as we touched on earlier, a sandbox versus a railroad. So,
the first one that I'll talk about is talking about the Tomb of Horrors, actually, which we mentioned briefly earlier. Some of the instances that I had was basically relating to a player in this environment.
Well, before we jump into examples, should we perhaps explain what was meant by sandbox and railroad?
Sorry.
People are aware what we're talking about.
So the way that I would describe a sandbox is it's kind of like you've got an open world or an open format wherein players can interact and kind of go where they would like. Kind of like an open world RPG that you can sometimes play. A railroad I would describe more as like a series of missions that are run in a chain.
Well, it's very much like a railroad, so you think of a train, it has the tracks are the plot. The train cannot leave the tracks, so the train just goes along the tracks like a railroad.
Sometimes following the railroad can be fun, as in I have had some very fun and enjoyable games where it was a railroad, and sometimes if you're just happy to enjoy the view from the railroad, it can be fun. But I kind of like a blending of the two. In my games as well, where I give players missions they follow, but they've got freedom in how they go about them.
Yeah, like one of the things about a railroad adventure is that it's very set in, you must go here, to go to here, to go to here, to go to here, to go to here. And it doesn't really allow much for if the players want to deviate off that. And that's somewhat down to a DM style, somewhat down to like what the style of game. Some people really like it, other people's are less good. It's all about balance, in my opinion, though.
Everybody enjoys different styles of games. So some people really enjoy playing in sandbox style games where they can sort of go about their goal in any way they desire, almost any way they desire. And some people enjoy Railroad.
Well, the kind of like I've mentioned about the downside of Railroad, there is also a downside I found to sandboxes. Like neither can really be done in excess, because I've found so many times with the sandbox, you kind of say, "Okay, players, here is a world. Go do things," and the players go, "We don't know what we want to do," and just sort of stand there and don't do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that in my 3.5e game that I run on Mondays is very much sort of sandbox style game. There is an overarching sort of mission, a goal that the players need to go and accomplish. And what I will also do is I'll throw in diversions for them as well, to keep the players occupied, to keep things fresh, so it doesn't just seem like a slog along the railroad. We need to go to here, then to here, then to here. So the players can kind of sort of choose the route they want to take, assess how dangerous they think it's going to be, which cities do we want to visit along the way. And I think it gives them that aspect of freedom of the sandbox while giving them the overarching guidance that a railroad can give.
I tend to prefer a mix of the two. I think we're both in agreement in there. I think it's probably the majority opinion that it is better to have a mix of the two. But I do know some people that are very railroady in terms of GMs, and it doesn't mean they're bad GMs. It's just that as we've mentioned, there are some people that aren't super good at improvising or thinking on their feet, and it's just a limitation of some people, unfortunately. But it doesn't mean that they can't run games. It just means that they know where they want to go, and they know they know and it's going to be cool. And you can usually be quite confident that a game that might be closer to railroaded than sandbox is going to have a very obvious track for you to follow.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. But as I said, I mean, I have enjoyed railroad games, and I think it sometimes does depend on the system. So some systems, the railroad is more enjoyable than others.
Also depends on the person running it, because you get
players.
2 railroad systems or 2 railroad games, and one GM you'll have a blast of a time. The other GM, you'll kind of just feel very stifled.
No, I do think a lot of it does come down to the GM as well. As with most games, it's every GM has their own sort of unique signature, and I think everyone's got their own style of games. So, for example, in some of the games that I've been in with Andy, I know that Andy very much enjoys his intrigue, his political and background plots. So I know that if that's something I wanted to pursue in his games, I'd have a fun time doing it, because I know that Andy's really good. So not to toot your own horn too much, but I know that you're really good at working out sort of political plots and machinations, probably because you are just a drow at heart. I know, so I've played in a couple of Nick's games as well, and I think Nick's style is quite similar to mine as well, where it's we enjoy sort of the action and the dungeon crawls and all things like that, and enjoy that blending of sort of sandbox and railroad together, sort of giving players agency, but also letting them know that the world is still sort of this big, massive place.
So, out of interest, because just as you're talking about, you often give the players this sort of like little, I guess, baits around the place for them to kind of grab at, and as they kind of progress towards the plot, what do you do if they don't bite?
Freak out. No. No. If sometimes you will get players where they will not follow the hook. They just will keep running from it, and they don't follow the clues that you expect. In pre-published and pre-generated adventures, normally those hooks are done for you. So if you're running a pre-published adventure, my advice would be to, in your preamble at the beginning, is kind of work that hook in. If you're running this at a conventional, it's just a one-shot, you know that you're only going to be running for sort of 4 or 5 hours. So I think that it's normally a good idea to sort of cut down the introductions and whatnot at the beginning, and kind of just put the players at the beginning. So if, for example, the king of a kingdom is hiring adventurers to go and do this, don't let the players see the advert. Say, you have been brought before the king in order to fulfill this mission. So you sort of skip ahead a little bit from the hook if you're worried about that. In longer campaigns, I tend to find that players will often avoid the hook, and they'll go after the random NPC that you threw in because you couldn't think of anything else, and they're not going for the interesting one that you spent hours tailoring. Not bitter, I promise.
I have an interesting thing to add to that about what if the players don't take the don't take the bait, as it were. It's a brief entry in the beginning of Descent to Avernus, which is quite funny actually, the way that they described it. As I mentioned earlier, the Flaming Fist have, in Baldur's Gate at least, during times of emergency, have the authority to forcibly conscript adventurers, or who they believe to be adventurers, into doing a service for the city. And as the game begins and you have this happen and you're summoned by one of the captains to go and perform a service for them to help them deal with the lockdown and the people that are in there and the things that are going on, basically it says, if the players don't, once they've been summoned, if they don't report to him within 24 hours, he will send out lieutenants searching for you. And if after 72 hours you still haven't shown up, or they have failed to show you up, they will kill you.
It's one way of doing it.
And the game's over. But with that said, I think if you're playing a pre-pub adventure and you're not taking the bait, I think you're doing it wrong.
I think if they come and kill you, that's probably going to be the fastest you ever complete a pre-published adventure.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that happens.
Well, actually, I have something that's kind of the same, only taking a different spin on it. Less of where they are not taking the bait, but more they find a different bait that you hadn't really planned for. So I ran a while, like many years back, one of the exalted pre-published adventures called Disease of an Evil Conscience, which is a suitably ambiguous name. Essentially, like what was going on was you had a city where everyone was suffering from this disease within the city, and minor spoiler warning, well, probably more major spoiler warning, but the reason everyone was getting a disease was because this Fae, who was living like nearby, had essentially, they had a grudge against the city, and they had put a curse upon the city, like specifically the land of the city, and that's what was causing the curse. And so the book kind of assumes, oh, you're going to go there, you're going to either fight the queen, or you're going to convince the queen to let them off. That's not what my players did in the slightest. They decided that one person had heard about essentially through early in the campaign, they come across this large plain which was nearby, and the party had this great idea where we're not going to do any of these things that were suggested. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to migrate all the entire populace of this city to this new city we're setting up. Which entirely destroyed the narrative, because, like, essentially everything was all of a sudden solved. There is no curse anymore. People are fine. They just had to go around and convince everyone to leave. And that, what I guess part of the reason I brought this up is because they kind of created their own like hook, and then sort of went with it. And rather than trying to drag them back onto the original plot, I kind of just went, okay.
Yeah, no, I get you. Do you think there's a fine line between deviating from the rail and then straight up derailing a campaign?
I think it depends somewhat on the context. So if it's derailing the campaign, as in it's just sort of ruining the plot without really giving them a way to progress it in a different angle, then that's not good. Whereas if it's being derailed, but it's creating this more interesting plot that's going like that way in the complete opposite direction to the original plot, then that's a lot more interesting. Though, caveat, if you're not especially that the second option does require you to essentially go from having a pre-published adventure to your own adventure that you've written, so to speak.
So I have a good example of that as well, where it's just sort of derailed. I was running Tomb of Horrors, and in that there are myriad traps that are mind-bogglingly complex, and you're never going to get them right the first time. And it was when I started suspecting that one of the players had read the book, because they had encountered one of these traps. I won't specify which trap. I'm not that nice to all of you that may play it in the future. However, they were able to, in the space of about 10 seconds, exactly know how to disable one of the traps. And I'm not talking about, I know that I need to push this button, this big red button, it will stop. No, it was more like they knew the specific way that they could use something that it wouldn't kill them, when there were like 5 other choices which would have instantly killed them. And I can understand that can be down to luck. There was no discussion, there was no debate, there was no asking the party what they thought would be the normal thing. It was just, no, boom, boom, do this, and I'm going, that worked. The next trap, I'm going to flip it, so if he does the right thing, he'll die. But I think that was sort of, in essence, derailing it, because it's taking away from the adventure itself, and what's the point in reading ahead in an adventure? You're only spoiling the fun for yourself.
I actually wouldn't call that derailing, because it's not moving the plot anywhere. It's sort of just spoiling the puzzles. So I'd give that a different name, something like...
That's metagaming, isn't it, really?
Spoiling the fun.
Actually, no, it's not really metagaming. Metagaming is a bit more involved.
Sort of metagaming, it's sort of player knowledge.
Yeah. Actually, that's one thing we're going to be talking about a bit later, I think. Not necessarily in this episode, maybe the next one. We might touch on it a bit. But,
well, just while we're here, and again, we've had a new term mentioned, which we should probably explain. What is meant by metagaming?
So, metagaming is using your knowledge as a player to influence your knowledge as a character. Probably one of the obvious examples of this is if you are, for instance, a character in a insert D&D module here, and you come across a troll. Now, your character may have never come across a troll before, but as a player, they may know that you can only kill a troll with fire or acid. And there's a reason why you have knowledge rolls in D&D, is to see if you actually have knowledge about these things. If you're all good enough, you might even know in character, but if you don't, then you have a problem.
Well, it's also, you can have cases where, because that's what I'd call a lighter version, where some groups just sort of allow it, other groups less so. It depends on the group. But a more extreme example is, let's say, for example, a player has decided to, I don't know, maybe they're playing a necromancer, and they decided to, in secret from the rest of the other characters in the party, gone to a graveyard to dig up some bones, and none of the other characters have had any knowledge of this. And then when he comes back, one of the players just says, "Oh, my character asks you why you've been to a graveyard," and the character shouldn't have any knowledge of it, and essentially it's spoiling this player's initiative. And that's kind of what I'd say is a more extreme version of metagaming, where the character should have not known or been there or really done anything about it, but they've acted with that meta knowledge.
Acting on player knowledge rather than character knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be. For the most part, I think people are, in my experience, people are generally good about not letting things like that happen. In games I've run, I've described or shown an image of a monster just to give players more of a better visualization of what a thing is. But in character, out of character, they know what it is, and they might even know more about the thing than I do. But in character, they'll try and make an effort to not say anything, or just be or just try and take a back step to let other people try and figure it out.
This happens to Ciaran every time he throws in something demonic while I'm in the game.
Oh, that you You know what it is, and it's like, I know what that is
Yeah.
out of character. In character, I hate you. And then
Well,
you
I
get
think it's
pity
why
at the fun things.
sometimes. I think it's why sometimes I enjoy changing things or using some other sort of published sources which may not be as well known to a player. Or just changing stuff. Just keep the monster, reskin it if you think that that's happening. Because if you've got, so for example, I'm quite an experienced D&D player, as we all are. So if you put a general, as you mentioned, sort of a troll in front of us, in our heads we're going, troll, we have to use fire and acid. But the difference is that we would rationalize that as a character, going, oh, let's do a knowledge check, or oh no, this just doesn't seem to be working, let's try something else. You sort of rationalizing your character. So an example of this was in John's Wednesday game, when we went up against this, it was a helmed horror, and I'm playing a warlock. They're immune to force damage. All of my awesome spell effects are force damage.
You know what I'm going to ask now? What is
What's
a
a
helmed
helmed
horror?
So helmed horror is an arcane construct formed basically of magic and basically sort of elemental energy that's been bound into a suit of armor, normally designed to guard particular areas. So they're immune to force damage, and I'm sort of there looking at John the DM going, I hate you. But I didn't let that impact my character, so the thing I would normally do is I would start off with some Eldritch Blasts. So Eldritch Blast is the standard spell of a warlock that deals force damage. It pings off its armor, and someone goes, didn't work, you dealt no damage. You're going, let's go to my next thing, let's do a lightning bolt, which helmed horrors are immune to. But I didn't allow my player knowledge to impact my character knowledge, and I think it was appreciated, because I then went, right, this didn't work, and I'm shouting that out to the rest of the group. But no, I think that's sort of where you can mitigate your own metagaming.
Yeah, it's for the most part, I found metagaming is engaged in by accident, which is usually what happens. At least in my experiences. I mean, I think we've all metagamed at some point. It can just be a reflex, because we're expected to, we've played games before. We kind of know what's what's what. It can bleed over, but it's good to keep in check with that as well. And it's very good if the DM can keep in check with it as well.
There's also the flip side is there's some times where it's like, well, my character, I don't know this. My character should probably know this. So that's probably something we can cover at some point.
Yeah. Actually, one thing I wanted to bring up, because to round out this subject at least, when it comes to players going off script, was a particular thing that happened in Descent to Avernus. Essentially, the party had to meet a particular dude in a rather large house. They knew he was in there, but they didn't really have any good way of getting in, aside from kicking the door down and beating up guards and then finding him. So our resident sorcerer, who I mentioned earlier, had learned Disguise Self, which is good for this, because earlier on in the game, they met one of the brothers of this person they were trying to find. And he studied the person and then was able to replicate with Disguise Self and take on the appearance of this person. And they used that to get inside the villa and then get inside the room where the person is that they were looking for. None of that is referenced in the adventure itself. What is expected of the party is to either take that brother as prisoner and then bring them in and then let me in or he dies, etc. And then they work their way up and speak to the other dude. The other way is to kick the door down, break some jaws, break open windows, climb in, and go through it that way. I won't get into what happens in terms of the plot, but that entire section ended up being completely improvised on my part, and I think of it quite well, especially at the ending with the evil minds think alike in the party, which was really funny. Ciaran was a prime architect of that. If you would like to tell them what happened.
So, it's a little dark, but I was an evil character, still am. As I was playing a Yuan-Ti Pureblood called Jesse, or ESC. And a Yuan-Ti Pureblood is a sort of a snake-human hybrid type thing. And they are immune to poison. And what I did was, we had this, I can't remember what his name was now.
Thirstwell.
This Thirstwell. Spoilers. And what we done was we said, we can't leave him here conscious. So we knocked him out, went, right, let's tie him up and put him in his bed so it looks like he's just asleep. That way, if the guards look in, when we leave, we'll go, he's sleeping, he's very weak, leave him alone. So I was messaging Nick, because we were running this online, and I said, I've got an idea. When we gag him, because we know he's a spellcaster and we don't want him to cast spells, in the middle of the gag, I'll put some of the imp poison that we harvested from his pet that we killed. That way, as he salivates, it will soak into the gag, and the poison will slowly be released. And if he wakes up and tries to sort of bite into the gag, it will be released even faster. So I did that, and then someone else was doing his legs, and then I sort of headed away, checked the knots on his legs, and the other person checked the gag. And then what I'd found out later was that the person that checked his gag put another dose of poison onto the gag. And then a third person had also planned to do the same thing on the gag. And as we're sort of leaving, I'm going, I hope that one dose was enough. He'll probably just stay unconscious for a long time, but he might live. Second and third dose made sure he didn't. But the rest of the party, the good members of the party, were there going, no, it's fine. Like, we've left him alive. Their consciences were clean.
Yeah, three party members individually conspired to do the exact same thing.
Great minds.
It was very funny, especially when we realised that everyone did that. After Ciaran had done it, he did it first. One of the other players, when they wanted to do it, they PM'd me saying, I want to poison him while he's asleep. I was like, make an insight check. He's like, you notice that the Yuan-Ti has done that already.
They don't know I'm a Yuan-Ti. I am a normal, looks in notebook, human.
Oh yes, that's right. Yes, excuse me. You are quote unquote human.
I wish to point out that he borrowed this character concept from me.
Yes, a long time ago, but yeah.
So let's move on. That was a good discussion, I think. Let's move on to making the plot relevant to players.
Yeah, so I think we've kind of talked about this quite a bit already, so we don't have to take too long here. But one thing that's to help draw players into these kind of pre-written adventures is to try and, like, as part of reading the story, to find ways to make the story relevant for those players. So a player is playing a noble from a disgraced house. Well, what about if one of the villains is the person who disgraced the house? It gives the character a reason to really want to kind of engage in the plot. Now, like, a lot of the kind of pre-writtens do that with a lot of their pre-gens, and so they'll have a pre-gen of, this is a musician who is on the run from a noble, and then they will specifically have the noble show up later. And one thing you can also sort of do is take these sort of things they've kind of written into the pre-gens and sort of just lift them and change them around so they apply to if a player has brought their own character in, so to speak.
It's it ties into nicely to the branching out and improvising into a established story. At least if I run pre-pub adventures, I tend to not like to do that much, unless there is something in the game where you can establish a particular character as a particularly important character within the narrative. Think like Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars, where he's a character, but then ends up with this massive prophecy behind him, bringing balance to the Force and all that rubbish, midichlorians, etc. Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Ciaran? Not midichlorians.
No. So I would say with a lot of it, as Andy said, it can be quite important to make sure that there are linkages from a character into a game, because it helps make the player feel that their character is invested. So it gives their character motivation to follow along with this adventure. And even in sort of other adventures, so if you're doing your own personalized adventure, so in the Call of Cthulhu game that I ran, the way that I made it relevant to the players was that they all had some interest in the occult, and they all sort of got brought in on that basis. So that was the initial linking factor with those characters, which helped in the beginning tie them together for that first adventure. And then they went on, they had all these experiences dealing with horrible Cthulhu mythos creatures. And then from that point on, it's much easier to continue because they've had these experiences, they've bound themselves together. So I find that the first adventure that you run is probably the most important because it's laying down that basis. What is it that is keeping this group together? Is there something that you can do that keeps it relevant to them, keeps their characters invested, makes the players feel their characters will be invested in it?
There's at least if you're doing prepubs, at least the players kind of get invested into the game by an actual result of playing the game. But yeah, I mean, I think that's down to preference. At least when it comes to adventures, as I said, I don't really like to. It depends on the game, really, but I tend to use the plot hook as the thing to invest them into the game. Yeah, moving on from there, I think this is a particular point that we haven't really talked about much. Running a pre-published adventure as a standalone game versus working it into a larger campaign that you may be running.
So I've got some experience with this. So I've run a couple of 3.5e games, which are primarily set in the Forgotten Realms. So it's the largest campaign setting for Dungeons and Dragons to date. And the benefit that I find is that there's a huge wealth of information that you can draw upon. So I'd run sort of a standalone adventure to begin with, sort of a little thing to whet the player's appetite to get them invested, and then you can see about working that original adventure into something bigger, into a larger campaign. So you can almost use a pre-generated adventure as a springboard into a proper campaign, which is what I did in this instance. So the game that I've run on Monday nights, it initially began as a little map that I'd found in one of the source books, and a little adventure that was to it, and I added sort of another hook into it. So I changed sort of the motives for the players going there, but I kept it because, as we've said before, maps, NPCs, and enemies and whatnot are always useful to have if you're running something for the first time. So my experience with it was, once I'd worked out that the players in the group, for the most part, meshed very well together, it meant that I went, yes, I'm comfortable with moving this onward and feeling comfortable continuing with that group. And it's sort of flourished, and I was able to incorporate that little standalone adventure into something much bigger, and it gave me the guidance I needed to move things forward.
So, yeah, I mean, when it comes to working into a large campaign, there's a lot of footwork that needs to be done by the GM in terms of, is this a game that's already set in that campaign setting? You know, could I take a game that's based in Planescape? Could I convert that over to Eberron, for instance, or Forgotten Realms? Generally, no, but there are, if you've run games enough, you at least understand the settings enough, you probably could adapt them into a way that it makes sense.
I think Planescape is probably one of the easier examples to fit into almost anything.
Yeah, because it is
exactly, it is a game about hopping planes. But I think if, for example, you were trying to integrate Eberron into the Forgotten Realms, these are two different campaign settings. So they're classed as sort of different worlds, as it were, usually inaccessible to each other. So you can use effectively pre-published adventures and pre-generated ones, because a lot of the time, with some minor tweaking, you can fit them in almost anywhere. You go in and deal with this dungeon, you could move that easily to another campaign setting.
One thing, just to talk about the advantages of running them as standalone, is that, especially for some like the smaller adventures, or even just like the ones where they're just self-contained, because they are essentially a standalone, you don't have to get massively invested into whether your character survives or not, so to speak. It's nice to kind of like bring a character in, play through a story, and then that's where the story ends. It ends at a high point. It ends where kind of like you've succeeded. You are now rich beyond your measure. You don't need to like worry about how are they going to deal with the next upcoming bad. It's like their plot's finished.
Yeah, it's I think there is a it depends on the player as well. Like I'm running Descent to Avernus as a standalone game. It is set in Forgotten Realms, but I'm not weaving it into a larger campaign. I've actually toyed with the idea of not so subtly inserting a prepub campaign into my Pathfinder game, which I haven't done yet, but I've been considering adapting a much older game from a different system into it that I don't think anybody is playing. I think it'll be quite interesting to look at that. But we're going to move on to the final the point for this episode at least, which has gone on a bit longer than I think we intended it to. What if you don't want to give away that it is a pre-built campaign? What can you do to disguise it? Especially when you have long-standing venerable players that have played untold, have been playing longer than others have been alive, for instance. How do you disguise it?
Well, I'd say the first thing you should do is when you're like running it, don't get the book out.
Oh yeah, that's helpful.
I think another one is never say the name. It's never I know that sounds like the simplest one, and it can sometimes be the hardest one. It's also things like little tidbits of plot that you might accidentally say if you've reskinned it could tip players off. As Nick said with running sort of Descent to Avernus, you're going to Avernus.
Actually, a friend of mine that ran a game, I think this is quite a funny example, because what he ended up doing, in general, this might be a good idea, but we were playing in person, so we kind of clocked on towards the end of it. Was that he had actually bought a second copy of the core rulebook, cut all the pages out, and then took a prepub adventure and just inserted it into the covers of the player's handbook. And because he had a GM screen for the entire time, like he had this book in front of him, and it turns out he was referring to the campaign the entire time. But one week he forgot that he forgot to bring that, but he still had the book there, and we began to kind of realize that he was actually looking at the book, and then we was like, "Is this a prepub?" And then we were near the end of it, and he was like, "Yeah." But that was quite a cool way of hiding it, I think.
Like sometimes actually some prepubs put in tips for how to hide the fact. So there was actually, I can't remember if it's a cyberpunk or a Shadowrun adventure. So cyberpunk and both Shadowrun, they're set in the far future. In the century, corporations are big, fantasy like races are around. That's the thing. But there was one about Cthulhu in I'm going to say it was cyberpunk. So like there was this entire thing where you go into this place and there's an AI that's gone crazy, and that's because it had summoned like a eldritch horror which had corrupted it and stuff. And like the book went on explaining, oh, by the way, don't let anyone realize you're running this, and had various ideas for like maybe write all this stuff out but don't let them know that you're about to drop this on them. Yeah,
in fact, the big example I want to give to this is one of the best campaigns I've ever played. I was a player in this, at least. And I didn't realize it was an adventure until a lot later after the game had ended. Partly because we all died before it ended. But so this game is called The Apocalypse Stone. It is my second favorite prepub adventure I've ever read. It is really good. Yeah.
Spoiler warnings.
Yes, there are going to be more spoiler warnings in this than otherwise. But I'll try to leave out I'll try to leave out characters and what happens other than what is implied by the title. So the Apocalypse Stone is it was released in the year 2000 for 2nd edition AD&D. It was not designed with a campaign setting in mind. It was designed as a game you could adapt to basically any D&D game, or any other game really, if you want to get down to it. But you can insert it into anything, and the entire point of the campaign is everything ends. It is literally the apocalypse. Everything is going to end. This is a game to end a long-standing campaign with. It's recommended for players level 15 and above, and it is statted to offer, I think it's like 60 to 90 combat levels of experience. So it is one of the hardest games ever written. It's about on the same level as Tomb of Horrors, like the original, in terms of in terms of how difficult it is, and it's like that by design. One of the main things about this campaign is the way that it needs to be run, and they make it very clear in the book. I'll refer to the paragraph here, where they tell you basically how you need to run this game. Obviously, spoilers here. If you want to use this in a game, make sure they don't listen to this bit of the podcast. The players undertake what they initially to be a divine quest. But then they will discover way later that was a terrible lie. Worse, their participation in that divine quest leads to the extermination of reality, effectively, and it's essentially impossible to return it. It is meant to be the ending a game with a bang, literally.
I believe the term I'd use here is whoops.
Yes, the PCs eventually learn that they have had a hand in setting these events in motion, and are partially, fully, albeit unintentionally, responsible. They also realise that they can do little, if anything, to prevent the coming apocalypse. Following on from that, it says,
I have a feeling that if next time you run your Pathfinder, if an angel suddenly shows up and is like, by the way, guys, I have this awesome quest for you that's going to totally involve something awesome and divine, I'm going to look at you and give you the stink eye.
Oh, no. I'm going to make it, I'll make it much more cryptic. Like, you need to help an old lady cross the street.
We're drow, we don't do that stuff.
Also, as we went over in the last episode, we don't trust old ladies. At all.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, we can't do that.
That was one of the main sticking points. The end of the last video was do not trust old women.
So following on from that paragraph, it says, read this adventure very carefully before running it. The plot is complex and requires you to pull the wool over the eyes of the player characters and the players themselves. Yes, that's right. The players must believe this is a typical adventure for the setup to work. The most important piece of advice is to lie to your players. No, really. Hide it inside another module. Pull out the pages and put them into a binder, whatever it takes to keep your group from suspecting this adventure is different from the rest. Without the shock value, the impact is considerably less. Also, make sure that quest that you're sent on doing is the end of adventure. Come back after a year of sessions, play something else in that setting, and then start bringing out all the bad stuff that is going to happen. And it is a really cool setup.
I'm guessing this is also if you want the players to hate you for a year.
Yes. It gets really bad as well as the game goes on. One of the things I remember, this is a rather big point, I think, and it's one I will spoiler warning, is that as the game goes up, once this has happened, if you're going to disguise it in another game and then play something else for a long time, eventually they'll find out that the divine spellcasters, especially the clerics, no longer get their spells back because the gods have been killed.
Oh, that gets dark.
It's really it's such a cool setup, I think, and then because they spend the rest of the game figuring out what the hell happened, and by the time if they find that out, it's already too late and the world's over. It's really cool. I like it, but it's a very interesting game. It's we never finished it. I think we got about 2/3 of the way through it, and we were killed by a Tarrasque, which is basically Godzilla. And that wasn't even the final combat. This is balls hard for a campaign.
I think that's probably a very good note to end it on, though.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, our next episode will be. Let me check my calendar here. Will be on the 20th of November, and we'll be part 2ing this particular discussion, and we'll be talking about adventures that have been written by players to involve characters in it, creating our own character settings and things, which I think we've all we've all had a hand in doing. And yeah, so it should be a fairly good discussion. But with that said, thank you everybody for listening. Alongside Richard and Richard, I've been Richard. Good night, everybody.